Welcome to Uncaged. Today we're speaking with Chris Copeland. Chris, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, Bant, pleasure to be here on the show.
Now, Chris is a really interesting guy. We're going to be talking about a lot of interesting stuff, all the way from nuclear energy into small to medium-sized businesses. He is currently the founder and managing director of Clubmoss, and Clubmoss is a wonderful company. It is a company that focuses on acquiring small businesses that really kind of helps them build out stronger operations, the right technology, and develop their leadership so that they can become companies that are more resilient and more valuable for the teams and communities that depend on them. So we'll talk a little bit more about what Chris's philosophy is with Clubmoss and what they're up to. But we're going to also talk a little bit about his background. And I guess with that note, Chris, let's get into this. Tell me a little bit
Sure.
about yourself and your career.
Yeah, great. Happy to do that. I think if you were to look me up on LinkedIn, my resume probably doesn't exactly read like a straight line, but effectively they're the same job, right? Figuring out what's actually true about something complicated before you commit to a decision you can't take back. So grew up academically in physics, where physics is basically operation through first principles. And then that took me to a period of time where I worked in the control room of a nuclear power plant, where
Wow.
you're effectively doing that with instruments and procedures on a clock because the plant really doesn't wait for you to feel ready, right? And then more recently spent a bit of my career at a large global consulting firm called McKinsey and Company, where really working with data and interviews, usually for somebody who's already decided what they want to hear.
Hmm.
And then now to what I'm doing at Club Moss, which is taking majority investments and buying businesses where a seller's books were never really built to tell you the truth, but to optimize and minimize taxes. So ultimately, I'd say my career has really been a function of different tools, the through line being the same question. What's really going on here? What could
Yeah.
go wrong? And how would I know before it did?
Yeah, and I would say that whilst it moves from, I'd say, services, consulting services, all the way into nuclear power, what an incredible background. I mean, you've seen so many different things from so many different dimensions and angles, and what a great background for then to look at helping businesses push themselves to the next level. And that's really what you're trying to do with Club Moss. So I love this idea of community anchors, not flip targets. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Maybe let's talk about them in a few different ways, right? So I think just to kind of highlight and set the ground on like what Club Moss is, right? Club Moss really has two specific arms.
Hmm.
One is on the buying and taking majority investments of existing small businesses. And then the other is consulting and advising on those businesses. And so at Club Moss, what we try to do is really deliberately focus on only a few different clients at a time.
Yeah.
And effectively, that's working the same muscle either way, whether you're doing it on the consulting and advisory side or you're doing it on the buying and investing side. And so on the anchor language that we use in Club Mods, let me define it because I think the consequence is very important. So when I say anchor, an anchor is a business in the community where you would actually notice it if it disappeared, right? You probably
Hmm.
have some of those in your backyard, Bant, or even on your
Yeah.
drive from work going to home. This could be the specialty contractor that three specific school districts depend on from a tax base, right? This could be the lab where every municipality in a region sends work. These usually have roughly anywhere from 50 to 100 employees. It could be 30 years in, where the owner's name is really on the back of his or her truck.
Hmm.
And it's not just about the sentimentality of it, right? I think that is an important piece of this, but I care about it because of the underwriting. If you buy or take an investment in one of those businesses and cut that thing, chop it up like quite a bit of private equity does,
Hmm.
it's a completely different asset. And so what I tend to look at is almost certainly what is a crew, what is a response time, and how do you maintain and support and grow that asset rather than destroying it.
That's great. I've been thinking a lot about acquisition and brands and things like community lately myself. And it's funny because when we all learn about business and we read about these massive companies that appear overnight. Let's take like a Starbucks or something like that. For example, maybe it didn't happen overnight, but certainly steady growth, etc., and behind this one monolithic brand. But the reality is that communities aren't really always about those monolithic brands. Communities have local providers. It could be as something as kind of basic, or maybe critical, I guess, is like a plumber or something
Yeah.
like that, right?
Yep.
And I've felt that there's always been this deep focus in the branding world of like coming up with these mega brands or super brands, or everyone's got a phrase depending what you're talking to, BCG or McKinsey or whatever. They have their own phrase for what that brand is. But there's so much efficiency you can bring together behind the scenes,
Hmm. Hmm.
outside of that. I don't know. I'd be curious because there is that. I love that idea of like tapping into that connection locally, and I don't know if that kind of manifests itself in some of your deals.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think there's, as I mentioned before, there's certainly the sentimental value piece. And I think really when it comes to community, I think in this post AI world, people are really leaning in heavier on the human nature, the relationship driven that comes with not only relationships personally, but also the businesses that they support and buy from.
Hmm.
And if I were to take a step back around the quantitative aspect of what we're looking at here, these aren't right multi-billion-dollar businesses as you alluded to, like the Starbucks or other big brand CPG players or other retailers like a Walmart or
Yeah.
Amazon. These are really very small businesses. The way we define them at Club Moss are about $500,000 a year in profit, where you're really just buying yourself a job if you sit below that. And then we tend to go up all the way up to right around $2 million of profit, where
Yeah.
right up above that, you're going against the private equity or institutional capital that tends to compete at those levels. And so, in between, to your point around like brands and businesses, these are the businesses that can carry real management.
Yeah.
It's too small for a fund to care, and it's very often owned by somebody in their 60s with no succession plan. And that's the band where really the seller still cares who buys it, which is honestly the real edge that we at Club Moss tend to have and tend to focus on. And that's an important, I'd say, middle ground in the US market that's really important for us here. And so at Club
Yeah.
Moss, just to kind of highlight, right now, we're explicitly focused on three specific theses as we think about these community anchors, right? One is education services. And so that's anywhere from early childcare to K through 12 services, and then ultimately vocational and trade schools. I think everyone's seen the news on how important, especially in a post AI world, some of the trades are going to be as we think about build outs from data centers to ultimately this human nature.
Yeah.
I think the second theses we tend to focus on is on utility and infrastructure services. And this is one nobody thinks about. It's not the utilities, it's the companies the utility depends on, right? Line work and vegetation management for somebody like a Georgia Power or Duke Energy.
Hmm.
Contract operations and maintenance on municipal water and wastewater, which counties all over this state and all over the country rely on.
Yeah.
Sewer rehab, lift stations, meter services. I'd say all of these have an association of utility contractors, and most of those companies are owner operator with owners aging out. And then
Yeah.
I think the third is largely in business services, and that includes IT and cybersecurity, where a small organization has compliance obligations they can't staff internally, right? We've all heard the horror stories now that are emerging with AI on how important that is with models like Fable 5 or even OpenAI's model getting out of its secure environment and hacking Hugging Face, right? And
Yeah.
so we think about B2B services as also a complement, either spanning our services or explicitly focusing our services in our advisory arm, Clubmoss Consulting and
Well,
Advisory.
is that a big part of it, Chris? In this, I was reading an article about Bezos and a group of other kind of big time investors, and they're looking at essentially going into the reinvention of American manufacturing, right? That they're basically saying, well, we're going to apply machine learning across the board to relatively traditional businesses. I don't want to say they're old-fashioned businesses, but maybe they're even digitally forward businesses that might not have realized the advantages of robotics and machine learning yet. And I mean, when we look at a lot of the things that you're talking about, I would imagine there's going to be some play there that's combined with that first bucket that you referred to, which is this kind of this like reinvention of education, a rethink of education. Like I was talking to one of my good friends, and he said his son asked him what should he go into, and he said, and the dad is like successful banker. He said, "Should I go into banking, Dad?" And the dad said, "No, you should go into HVAC." Right? Because the guy, that what you're referring to, that infrastructure, we're very proud in America of our infrastructure, even though it's not perfect, but it's still built out, but it's going to need to be reinvented, modernized, and maintained, right? So there's a huge opportunity there.
Certainly, certainly. And yeah, I think just a couple reactions to that point. I think your first point around what Bezos and the rest of the team are doing, that's my understanding is Prometheus, which is a common through line, which is how do you amplify, accelerate many of the traditional businesses
Mm-hmm.
by leveraging AI as a layer on top of that, right? If
Right.
I were to rewind the tape a couple centuries ago when electricity was defined and what industries were present there versus the additional manpower that you were able to deliver with electricity, I think we're in the same place now. And that I'd say across the three different buckets that Clubmoss focuses on, that is one of the back end things that we think through are right. Unique to the specific workflows.
Mm-hmm.
What are the different ways that we can leverage AI, whether it's agents, whether it's intelligence, whether it's robotics, which is a little bit of what Bezos and Prometheus are thinking about from the
Yeah.
logistic line, which I think is an important piece. I think to your other point around where we are in the future, and if I were to be thinking about, hey, my child, where would I put him or her, or advise him or her on what they should be thinking about going in the future? I think it's a hard question. I think no one really can predict the future and what the outcome ultimately is. I think what history would say would be right, rather than predicting the specific industry or specific role that you want to focus on, what are the skills that I think will outlast and carry forward agnostic of what environment we tend to lay in? And I think
Yeah.
there's pieces around curiosity and leaning into that, which is incredibly important. I think there's an incredible important piece around human nature and really
Mm-hmm.
being able to be wise enough to really build relationships, have a sense of judgment that I don't think any amount of intelligence will be able to replicate. And so those would be some of the areas that and skill sets I would start to focus on. And I do a little bit of talking about this in some of the substacks that I read on.
One of the things I love about you, Chris, is that, when I talk to people that are like, let's say like innovative and entrepreneurially minded, they talk about things when things go wrong in such a positive way. Like it's like, well, I learned this. Whereas, when I talk to other friends who are certainly not entrepreneurial, when you talk about things going wrong, they panic. They're like, oh well, but what if this happens, right? And I was looking at some stuff, and I know that you come across deals sometimes that don't work out, right? Acquisition deals that don't develop in the way that you want. But I love the fact that you can learn from those things. Tell me a little bit about those experiences.
I will say, as being an entrepreneur, you have to be comfortable with taking punches in the face, but not
Yeah.
just taking them for the sake of taking them, but hopefully learning a bit more so you can avoid similar punches like that going forward in the future.
Yeah.
I think a couple come to mind, right? I think for sake of confidentiality, I'll describe the mechanics, not the company. So
Yeah, of
these were
course.
real people who opened their books to me in confidence. And the fact that I walked doesn't give me the right to kind of narrate their business. But a couple that come to mind. I think the first one is a vocational school in the Southeast that my team and I were working to close on. And
Mm-hmm.
effectively, the diligence process lasted for about 6 months. And that deal died. And let me start with like why I wanted this business in the first place, right? Again, this worked in an industry that, from a demand standpoint, historically and projected, had huge growth waves. The students paid tuition across 12 to 24 months. The revenue was pretty predictable. It was hard to disrupt. And so I thought, because the training was so hands-on, again, this importance of human relationships, you could add students without adding teachers one-to-one. And it wasn't a diploma mills. Like, graduates were actually getting hired and
Mm-hmm.
actually really growing their lives and livelihoods as a function of that. So really driving true impact to the graduates and ultimately the industries that they went into. I think what I underweighted during that experience was just how much enrollment swung. So, right,
Mm.
the annual averages kind of hid that completely around like how the seasonality went up and down. And in our more recent one, there was a third spring where we were in the middle of diligence where you actually saw like a massive uptick in student enrollment.
Yeah.
And while we were there, AI started reshaping the job market, right? So this was, call it, end of 2024, going into early 2025. And you can account for how fast just the environment was changing there. So ultimately, the seller terminated the deal. And it wasn't over a function of price. It just got too complicated and she just wanted simple.
Mm-hmm.
And what you started to realize with this is not, I think a lot of people come in outside in and say, hey, ultimately, if someone's selling something, they want the highest price as possible. What
Right.
they fail to recognize is the emotional fatigue and really the identity that one would have with that business and giving that up. So that's one that comes to mind. Happy to share another if it's helpful.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I love it. I mean, these types of examples are wonderful. You know, the vocational one is such a fascinating challenge because, you know, education has been, you know, it's almost perceived as a not a business sometimes. And so, you know, trying to kind of get them to think about the same efficiencies and the same structures as a business, it can sometimes be difficult. I'm an adjunct professor myself, and I'm the son of a professor and the grandson of another professor. So I've lived on university campuses all around the world. So I'm very familiar with that. But I mean, I love the fact that you're looking at those spaces, you know, because that is absolutely critical. You know, where you have obviously these bigwigs that we read about, like Elon Musk saying university's irrelevant or whatever. You know, you can learn everything online, but we know people still need to be taught. It's just human nature. It's how we learned from our parents, our community leaders. That's kind of how we grew up, and I think it's almost like a human thing. We need some level of pedagogy, right? So, but the reality is that vocational layer that we were just talking about for in communities, for all of those areas of business that you talked about, those support companies for power, etc. I mean, there's such a lack of talent going into these fields. So there's a real need to get people going.
The second one is also in education, except this one much earlier on the spectrum. And like you, very much a fan of education. I was a former faculty member in the
Yeah.
Department of Physics at my alma mater and serve on a couple boards for some education focused charter schools here in Atlanta. But this one was much earlier in the early childcare space.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a husband and wife duo, right? They had operated about four sites
Mm-hmm.
of early childcare institutions, all within a network in the Southeast. And ultimately, that one fell apart. We never even got down to LOI. This was a non-broker deal, and
Mm-hmm.
this one fell apart just simply because what they recognized was a tension between what we do today and what my identity looks like post sale. And
Mm.
what you recognize with a lot of these sellers is it's really hard for him, her,
Dude,
or
you're
them to
bringing
kind
back
of,
a crazy memory for me.
yeah. It's really
you
hard for them
know,
to, yeah.
yeah, I worked on a deal once. A gentleman had a wonderful business, and he brought me into his business. And the idea that he had was he's like, I want to get out. I want to sell this business. I'm done. Right. And we were able to get him an incredible offer, all right, an incredible deal. And it was a good number, you know, everything he could have ever dreamed of. His wife was happy, right? And in the 11th hour, he called me and he had that kind of existential crisis of, but what will I do tomorrow? Like
Yeah.
what, you know,
Yeah.
I don't know what I should do. Like how can what's my purpose? And it was such a fascinating moment because I said, look, you know, this is everything that you've wanted, everything you've asked for. You're going to come up with something new. But he couldn't get over it. He was
Yeah.
like, no, 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 I don't know what to do. I don't know. I don't want to do the deal. I was just like,
Yeah.
you know, just like one of those moments you're just like, oh my God, you know. And you know, in his case, he really regretted it a couple years because the markets change, right? You know,
100%.
it's not like you're gonna be guaranteed to get that money 2 years later, right? So
100%. 100%.
You know, one of the other things, Chris, that I know that you look at is, you know, board work, board services, how boards operate. I kind of want to lean into that. I do a lot of board work. I'm a chairman. You know, I serve on public boards. What are some of the gaps that you're seeing on how boards work today in terms of, you know, the oversight that they're supposed to provide?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think there's quite a few, but I think the biggest gap that I've seen is that, yeah, most boards have really confused following the rules with actually providing oversight. And here's what I mean by that, right? The resume version of board service is a line on your bio and a photo. The real version is that you're responsible for overseeing an organization you don't run, using information that's handed to you by the people you're overseeing, right?
Yeah.
Very hard tension to kind of wrap your mind around, but to me, that's genuinely the hard problem, and almost nobody describes it that way. It's always the exact same problem as buying a business. You're on the
Hmm.
outside, you depend on the other side's reporting, and your job is to kind of try to figure out what's true anyway. But what it looks like in practice, from my perspective, is the board package shows up 72 hours before the meeting. It's 140 pages. It's all story and no numbers. And the meeting becomes a performance of oversight instead of oversight.
Hmm.
Everybody knows it. Nobody wants to be the one who says it because the executive director or CEO is doing hard work with too few resources and it feels
Yeah.
like an attack.
Yeah.
But the measurable version in my head, and you
It's
read things
also,
like,
you know, I'll be curious what you say to this one. So I've had board situations where you often get the feeling that you will be putting yourself in harm's way if you kind of like express too strong of an opinion, right? So you're kind of like, wow, nobody really wants to make these changes. Like this, you know, when I was early on into getting into kind of advisory and board work, you know, I thought my job was to help a business.
yep,
And so
yeah,
sometimes I would, you know, if I saw something going terribly wrong, I would be like, no, we should really reconsider it for some these 5 reasons. And I learned a couple valuable lessons there, which is one, don't be make sure that you're an advisor, not an operational thinker,
yep,
right?
yep.
Because if you go into operational mode on a board, you know, God forbid, you're going to end up being the CEO yourself. You know, right? Right? But it's better. It's really better to kind of figure out how you advise and counsel. It's quite an interesting element. I feel sometimes it's like more of a political thing, to be honest. But
Yeah, yeah. I mean, speaking of that distinction between advisor versus operator, as well as to your point around, right, are you ready to step into the CEO seat? It's an interesting nuance. Spencer Stewart kind of like, right, analyzes this pretty often. And then on that same survey, about 69% of them say they spend 10 hours a year or less on succession planning. So to your point, like, how do you think about being ready for that CEO if he or she would actually depart for
Yeah.
another job or, God forbid, death, right?
Yeah.
And so that's a hard challenge. I think I kind of came up somewhere where you're never allowed to declare yourself ready. You demonstrate it on schedule in front of somebody whose job it is to fail you. And so to your earlier point around, yeah, being that one person to kind of separate himself from the rest of groupthink and really like challenge the status quo of how to think about that. I think what I would push most, and I think it's harder to do than to say, but I
Very
think
hard.
most boards have
Yeah.
to have a mechanism for displaying like uncomfortable observations and
Yeah.
really speaking the uncomfortable truths. And so that job I described earlier, around working in the nuclear control room, leaning in on previous learnings like a Chernobyl or a 3 Mile Island, oftentimes most people don't get celebrated for prevention of the failure modes, but prevention of those failure modes are great because they're a function of someone speaking up in those uncomfortable truths.
Yeah, I love that. If someone wanted to reach out and learn more about what you're working on, where's the best place to find you?
Yeah, best place would be reaching out to me via our website, club-moss.com. You can also find me on LinkedIn at Chris Copeland. And then, as I mentioned before, I think an important part around sharing and learning from experiences is really reflecting and writing about what those look like. And so I do some of those writings via my Substack channels, whether that's through Earn and Own, which is more focused on the operator and investor lens. Clubmoss Consulting, which is more of our advisory and consulting learnings. And then personally around like things that I'm interested in, whether it's fitness, prayer, meditation, all that on Cope with Chris.
Well, listen, let me give you kind of like a final word here as we kind of close this thing out. You know, we've been talking to Chris Copeland, and Chris is the founder and managing director of Clubmoss, which acquires small businesses across the U.S. and makes them greater. He aims to strengthen their operations, make sure that they are applying the right technology, that their leadership structures are correct. Obviously, today we've been talking a little bit about even the board and oversight role and how the board operates as well. But they're aiming to build companies that are more resilient and more valuable going forward. And there's a huge community element here too. You know, looking at these businesses that play key roles in the infrastructure as well as the backbone of communities. Chris, it's been amazing to talk with you. Last word, any advice for folks out there that might be listening?
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, man. This has been an incredible conversation. I appreciate the time. I think we've talked through a lot, right? We've talked through my personal experiences, what we do at Clubmoss, all the way to recommendations for small businesses and boards. I think for anybody watching, I think it depends on who you are, right? If you own a business and you're somewhere in that long thinking about it phase, I'd say do one thing this year, right? Get your books to where they can answer a question, what you make by product line, what each job actually costs, real payroll, not because of buyers coming, but because that exercise will make you money, whether you ever sell or not. And because the most common reason a genuinely good business gets a bad price is that the owner can't prove what they already know. And if you're running an institution, I'd say trying to do serious work on a budget that never matched the ambition, that thing's going to be the thing that holds you back. I
Yeah.
don't think most people in that world have caught up to it yet, and it's worth an afternoon to find out. And I think if there's one thing underneath both of those, it's the sequence. Figure out how it fails before you fall in love with how it wins. Find out what's actually true before you commit to something you can't reverse.
I
Everything
love that.
else I do is downstream of that. So
Yeah, I love that. Well, Chris, amazing advice today. Thank you so much for being on the show, and we look forward to having you back.
awesome. Thanks, man.
Cheers.
Cheers.